Hello, everybody. So today was the runoff in the French presidential election. Much attention was generated by this election, and the result is now in. Emmanuel Macron is the next president of France with 64% of the vote, and Marine Le Pen, the rightist candidate of the Front National, got 36%. So Le Pen was projected to possibly get more than that. I guess her supporters' hope was that she could exceed 40%. But nevertheless, it's still a pretty high ceiling for the Front National to have achieved. Le Pen's father was in the runoff in the 2002 presidential election, and the coalescence against him was more stark. He only got 18%. So that's a pretty stark improvement for Marine Le Pen, at least if you want to compare her to her father's performance. So I don't claim to be an expert on French politics, but I have followed the election to some extent, and I wanted to point out some interesting findings based on the data. So Macron is he was a minister in the socialist government Francois Hollande, and then branched off to form his own political party, his own movement, and that's a first in the history of France. For the two main parties to have done so, at least in the modern history of France, for the two main parties to have fallen out of contention, and for somebody who was in line with establishment mores, but still had to construct his own political path to have ascended to the presidency is definitely historic, notwithstanding Macron of being of an ideological disposition that is not really that unorthodox. He's a centrist, globalist type. And by the way, globalism is a real political phenomenon, even though mostly you hear people on the right use that as a term of disparagement. I think it is still analytically accurate to assign to people like Macron. But here's an interesting finding. This comes from somebody who's analyzing the polling data, Stephen Wolf, who's a good follow on Twitter, @PoliticsWolf. He notes that Macron still won all reported income groups thanks to dominating among usually conservative retirees, but Le Pen did win blue-collar voters. So Le Pen, somebody who is seen as unacceptably reactionary, many even call her a Nazi, she won blue-collar voters in France. And then the writer and analyst Daniel Nichanian, who you might know as Taniel on Twitter, Taniel, he also adds that, quote, Le Pen did best among lower income voters and working class voters, which are also the demographic groups with the smaller turnout rates. So Le Pen's support was disproportionately concentrated among lower income and working class voters, but because they don't vote at as high a rate as people who are more affluent, it didn't bolster her vote totals sufficiently to get within really any kind of contention of winning. But still, those are interesting findings. These deindustrialized areas of France have trended toward Le Pen, whereas they had previously been bastions of French socialism and communism of the French left. So for this to have, them now to be the bedrock of Le Pen's support in France suggests a trend that people should keep an eye on. Another interesting thing is, although you tend to associate you tend to associate reactionary sentiment more with older voters, Le Pen, and this was true of the first round of the election as well, Le Pen does worst among the oldest voters. So voters age 70 and older is her weakest demographic, whereas she does relatively better among younger voters, which is different from the American election with respect to Trump. Trump did best pretty considerably among voters the older you got, and fared worse among younger voters. So that's just sort of an interesting inversion that's going on in France, and it goes to show that the parallels being drawn between Le Pen and Trump are not as neat or not as necessarily apt as people are indicating at this point. For one thing, Le Pen didn't seize control of a major political party in France. She had this, she's the leader of a relatively niche, of what had been a relatively niche party that ended up getting through to the second round, whereas Trump kind of mounted a hostile takeover of the Republican Party. So a lot of Le Pen's opposition came from conservatives in France, who, for the most part, rallied behind Macron. Although she obviously siphoned off some of the conservative vote because she improved pretty considerably on her performance in the previous round 2 weeks ago. So what are some extrapolations that can be made here thematically in terms of what this entails for geopolitics? Well, for one thing, there's definitely a tendency on the part of American commentators to Americanize foreign political developments and to try to fit them into the prism that we operate within. And I think that's often a mistake, but something that I noted, and I wrote about a quick little paragraph on Twitter, and I'll link to it in the description box, is that the one respect in which you can compare Trump and Macron is that neither held elected office prior to winning the presidency. Now, Macron did serve in government as a minister, but he was never elected to any office. And Trump obviously didn't serve in government in any capacity whatsoever. And that was, for Trump, a first in all of American history. And I think what this perhaps indicates, and again, this is just sort of, this isn't a thesis that I've substantiated with intensive research or fleshed out in an especially careful way, but one of my initial impressions that I think is roughly accurate is that, if any cross-continental lesson can be drawn, it's that the institutional backing of political parties is being rendered less and less necessary for candidates to gain a national following and to potentially win election on a national scale. Because the functions that party apparatuses previously served, especially promulgating messaging and organizing within the party and so on and so forth, those are being rendered more and more obsolete as technology basically supplants those functions. I think you saw that in France, where Macron just founded his own party, and that was enough to win. He circumvented the two main parties. Trump circumvented the two main parties in his own way by mounting this hostile takeover of the GOP. But generally speaking, I think what this can be taken as is indication that the range of political opportunities across the board is expanding. Now, there's an irony here because Macron, although he attained the presidency in an unconventional manner, he sort of still represents a conventional form of politics, maybe, characterized as staid technocrat vagaries. Maybe that's what I would characterize his predilections as. Somebody who is very comfortable with finance, in the world of finance capital, given that he was a banker who is committed to internationalism and liberal mores. Again, I don't want to overanalyze Macron because given that I don't speak French, and given that didn't visit France to cover the election. My analysis is necessarily going to be limited. And I have a hunch, given how badly the United States media covers politics for the most part, there's probably some distortion going on in France in terms of how he was represented in the media, and Le Pen as well for that matter. But broadly speaking, he represents a conventional politics, but he achieved a new means of acquiring power, spurred by, I think, this technological advancement that is allowing different kinds of people to enter politics without having to overcome the obstacles that had previously been in their way, by way of these party structures, which are becoming increasingly obsolete. So those are just some observations. Another observation is, American pundits who don't know what they're talking about are chastising Mélenchon, the left-wing populist candidate who I did an interview about actually a couple weeks ago on TYT Politics. They're condemning him for not having overtly endorsed Macron, even though he negatively endorsed Le Pen, or he said that he opposes Le Pen. He didn't actively encourage his supporters to vote for Macron. And that's supposed to be taken as a sign of naivete or of recklessness on the part of Mélenchon. And of course, parallels were drawn to Bernie Sanders supporting holdouts in the United States and Jill Stein supporters, because people still have an axe to grind about that, of course, in the U.S. But the circumstances are quite different. In France, Le Pen never really was considered to have a shot of winning anything. She was behind 20 to 30 points in the polls, whereas Trump was always basically within the margin of error throughout the entire campaign. So in that respect alone, the situations were drastically different. But anyway, those are some initial comments on what transpired. Interested to know what you may or may not think. And that'll do it for now. Have a good day.